is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Originally this week, I was going to do a different episode about some of my favorite books in atheism and humanism, and we'll do that episode a few weeks down the road, but there hasn't been a lot of politics on this show lately, and I'm really bothered by that because it's one of the selling points of my show. And I've had some real kind of evolutions of thought in my own thinking about some certain issues, and I knew the perfect guy to come on and talk about some of these issues. So I guess you might be my first return guest. Cory Johnston, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm
glad to be here.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. So, you and I, we've talked a lot about different issues, and we had a really great, I think, conversation about free speech and free expression and issues on college campuses last time around. And I did an episode a little while back talking about joining the new center and talking about that there's this sort of coalition of people who are either like center left or center right. I'm center left, who are interested in sort of creating a certain level of like civility in our politics and trying to be more pragmatic and help bring compromises to Washington and things like that, which is something I very much value. And one person that I kind of held up as a part of that, which I thought was initially a good thing to say, and I've since changed my mind, is Dave Rubin, host of the Rubin Report on YouTube. He has a massive following, and he was a big part of my thinking about this issue, him and Sam Harris. But I've had a real change of heart about Rubin because I think that while he may describe himself as being a part of the new center, I really don't think he is. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are about Rubin, and then I'm going to tell you what I think.
Well, I guess just from my perspective, I always thought of Rubin as a right-wing guy. He spends so much of his time attacking the left and appealing to people on the right that it's hard to view him as anything but right. I know he doesn't like that label, but I don't see him acting in any left, quote unquote, left wing ways. And I don't see any of his guests as leftists. And he's never challenging them in ways that one would expect a leftist to challenge a right leaning person.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's kind of one of my big issues is that there's one thing we talk a lot about in political science, and it's something called the Overton window. And the Overton window, for those who don't know, it's basically that in in society, there is a window of what is considered not polite discourse, but what is acceptable in terms of politics in a certain society. So the Overton window is different in different countries. So, for example, here in the United States, Democrats or people who are on the left, basically people like me or even people who are far more to the left of me, they are considered the left here in the United States. But if you were to take me and you would have put me in, say, Great Britain or Germany, I would actually probably be more close to the center, because closer to the center, or even center right, because the Overton window is so different, right? And the thing that I had a huge problem with, and it's this interesting thing that Rubin does, and I think a lot of it is either that he doesn't know he's doing it because he's that stupid, which I will get into that, or it's that he's consciously doing it, which again, I think he's like Trump. I don't think he's smart enough to know he's consciously doing it. Where he's saying, oh yeah, I'm in the new center. I'm the new center. We want to bring a new center to politics. No, that's not really what you're calling for. There's a difference between being a centrist, somebody like me who's sort of center left, who's like very socially liberal and is largely sort of economically liberal or sort of neoliberal. Somebody like me who's not, I'm more of like an Obama Democrat. I'm somebody who's more center left, and somebody who is a libertarian. Somebody like Rubin, who is a libertarian, and in some levels he'll tacitly own that, but he doesn't. And that's my big thing about him, and we'll come back to that in a second. So he'll say, "Oh, I'm a classical liberal. I'm the true liberal, and this and that and the other." But in reality, he's actually on the right. But by describing himself as the center and then bringing on people to his show, who he lumps in with that label, he's moving the Overton window to the right so that what is described as being the center actually really isn't. And that bothers me to no end. And basically, I'm going to give you my short rundown of basically that I was a huge fan of Dave for a long, long time. I loved his show when he first started, back when he was on Aura TV and he had Sam Harris on, and he had a lot of very prominent atheists and stuff on. And I really liked his show then, because it was all about like science and critical thinking. And he did have some people from the left on there. Like he had Cara Santa Maria and other people like that. But then there was a shift. And the shift happened when he went independent and he left Aura TV and he basically did the Patreon thing. And I noticed that the ratio to like good guests, so like for people I would watch, so I would watch for like Jerry Coyne or Lawrence Krauss or Sam Harris or Michael Schur or whatever, the level of good guests versus garbage YouTube asshole people was starting to skew. And I was very bothered by it. And so I'm like, who the fuck are these people? Why the fuck is he giving these people a platform? I mean, I understand the whole free expression of ideas thing, but like, wouldn't you at least once, if you're going to get some crazy right-wing asshole from YouTube, you'd get some crazy left-wing asshole from YouTube and kind of balance it out? Like, for every, right-wing asshole, like, I don't know, Lauren Southern or Mike Cernovich, you'd get some left-wing crazy motherfucker like Dan Arrow. I mean, you would think on some level you would want to do something like that, but he doesn't. And the big thing that bothered me too is there's a political commentator here in the States named Sam Cedar, who hosts a YouTube channel called The Majority Report. Cedar is a huge critic of Sam Harris. He says a lot of stuff about Sam Harris I don't necessarily agree with, but I think he makes good points about sometimes I think Harris goes too far about Islam, and I agree with Cedar on some of that. But Cedar has been trying to get on Rubin's show for months. And like, I'm a liberal, I'm a leftist, I want to be on your show, I'm all about the marketplace of ideas. And on the other end, it's just fucking crickets. And that makes me so mad because Rubin's all about, I'm all about the free exchange of ideas, and I'm all about free speech and talking about different types of people. And yet, I don't know why I made him sound like the teacher from South Park. but then when he has the opportunity to actually have liberals on his show, he doesn't do it. Or if he does do it, he usually does it as a different take, right? So he occasionally will have liberals on, like he had John Fugelsang on a while back or whatever. But it's my main thing is that I got to a point where I realized this show is becoming increasingly awful. And then there was the breaking point. And the breaking point was when he had Katie Hopkins on. That was the moment I lost my shit. Because I was like, first off, Katie Hopkins is a fucking joke and an absolute nutcase. This is a woman who said that there should be a final solution for Muslims in the UK after the Manchester attack. Like, on what world is that okay? And so, I basically was like, I'm done with this shit. And then you posted an excellent video by, and I forget the guy who does them, but it was an excellent video called Individualism versus Individuality. And love the video.
That's Peter Coffin.
Peter Coffin. Loved the video. And he had on this episode a YouTuber called ContraPoints. And I watched her videos, and I watched her two-part video series on the left and free speech, and how there's this weird double standard that often happens with people on this sort of free speech crusade, where Rubin will talk all the time a big game about freedom of speech this and free exchange of ideas, but when it comes to people criticizing him, he's very quick to like either try to sue them for libel, which he did to the Mother Jones journalist who called him out on the fact that he does soft shoe interviews with alt-right crazy assholes, or he'll block people. And then there's another YouTuber who I like named Nightmare Fuel. A very small YouTube channel, but excellent. Should be so much bigger than it is because it's good content. His political positions are pretty close to mine.
Okay.
And he's sort of center left, and he's basically made a cottage industry of calling out Dave Rubin's bullshit, which is wonderful. Especially, the other big thing that really bothered me is how soft he is on Trump. You ever notice that? Like he's very, very soft on Trump. Never really says anything about Trump, or when he does, it's usually a joke. And there's one other thing, and it's really interesting, and this is something that a lot of YouTubers have pointed out and other people have pointed out. Anytime Trump does something truly fucking awful, or some big scandal breaks about the Russia investigation, or just the sheer incompetence of him is incredibly clear, Dave takes a break. He goes off the grid. He's gone for a month and doesn't talk about anything. I also don't like the fact that he sort of backpedaled on his atheism too, which really makes me angry. And part of that is the fact that, you know, he's getting all that right-wing money and they love religion. So he's not going to talk shit about religion as much. And that bothers me to no end. And he did this AMA where people asked him about his belief in God. And he goes, well, you know, I may probably believe in some things that I don't have any evidence for. I don't know. Fuck you. Like, come on, have some balls, like actually stick up for your position. Like, seriously, like what the fuck is wrong with you? You already have the right wingers' money. Are you so worried that the Koch brothers and Learn Liberty are going to take your money from you? Like, come on, you're not, because they love you. You're their useful idiot. So why would you? So, right. Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting for a moment. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about ContraPoints' great videos about the free speech issue and what you think is the issue among this sort of cottage industry of the right who constantly talk about free speech, but they sort of want to have it both ways, where they're not very good with criticism and they're not very good at having guests who are different than them.
Yeah, I think ContraPoints videos made I think a really good point of pointing out the power difference between marginalized groups and the majority, and how free speech, if you just accept all free speech by all people, that can actually have a silencing effect on groups that are marginalized. And I really find that a lot of people on the right, they just absolutely refuse to accept that that's a thing. Like, I had a discussion with a free speech absolutist a while back who, and I mean, I have other issues with even calling oneself a free speech absolutist, but the idea that the speech that he used, or the things that he might say, no matter how hateful or how loud he might say them, might have an effect on the speech that others can perform, just completely eluded him. Like, he absolutely would not accept that. And I think that Peter Coffin also did a video on free speech a while back, and this seems to be something that, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to it, and obviously we don't want the government limiting speech.
No.
But the idea that as a society we can say, hey, I don't think that's an okay thing to say because it's going to hurt other people or it's going to limit their speech, that seems like a reasonable position to hold.
I totally agree. I mean, one of the things that I have an issue with is for me, I mean, I've always been somebody on the side of free speech, and I very much value free speech and freedom of thought and freedom of ideas and freedom of inquiry. But what I think is issue here is that, Hitch had this old video years ago, and ContraPoints brought it up, is this idea that, and this comes from John Stuart Mill in his essay on liberty, the idea that the value of free speech is not just for those who speak, but for those who listen and for those who have the right to hear. And I think that's important too. But this is the key element here, is that we're talking about the fact that the First Amendment, which I am a First Amendment champion, I love the First Amendment. Right. If I was going to get a tattoo, it's one of the few things I would get. But there's a difference between the First Amendment and how government deals with speech and how society deals with speech. And socially, we have different situations. So, for example, of course, people who have really extreme ideas have all the right in the world to say what they want, but they're not immune from criticism. And this is something I find very interesting, is that some on the right, and Rubin kind of does this a little bit, is anytime anybody kind of pushes back on a viewpoint they have, they sort of claim free speech. And they talk about how, well, I'm claiming free speech and I value free speech and you don't, and this and that and the other. But that doesn't really answer my question. You're just deflecting from the criticism. One of the values of a marketplace of ideas is the fact that not only do I have the right to speak and you have the right to listen, but you also have the right to speak and I have the right to listen, and that should be the case. And then it should be from a position of goodwill. And when it's not, socially, it can fall apart. And that's justified. For example, a great example of this was somebody on my Instagram account. We were talking in the comment thread on a photograph that I had posted or whatever. Mm-hmm. And we were having some interesting conversations. He talked about how people in the Middle Ages lived longer, which is an interesting but wrong assumption. I kind of tried to debunk him on that or whatever. But then it got to a point where basically he was an anti-Semite. And he got to a point where he did the whole, Benjamin Franklin talked about how evil the Jews were, which was a conspiracy theory that was kind of proffered up in the 1930s. It's not true. I looked into it. It's bullshit. Anybody can look it up. There's a Wikipedia page all about it. I think it's a skeptical wiki page about this or whatever. And basically sort of talked about like the Rothschilds, man, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, they fucking control everything. And like, international Jewry and all this crazy shit. And I blocked the motherfucker because first off, I'm not going to have an anti-Semite on my page. And the beauty of free speech is not only do I have the right to speak to you, but I also have the right to listen to you, but I do also have the right not to listen to you. There's a difference. Absolutely. There's a difference between somebody blocking your ability to hear somebody else, which is wrong, and you deliberately saying, I don't value this as a position, therefore I'm not listening to it because it's absolutely batshit. That's a legitimate position to hold. You might think I'm wrong, but that's a legitimate position to hold. And we do that all the time. There's stuff that's just so ridiculous and awful that we don't entertain it. And we should have the right not to entertain it. That's part of free speech. And that's the thing that like these sort of free speech absolutists do not understand.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's the idea that I can say whatever I want and you don't get to react in any way that isn't positive.
Exactly. As you would say, it's a free speech for me, but not for thee, which is kind of the issue here. And that's what really bothers me about it is that, first off, I am very much bothered in general by the right, especially the hard right, co-opting free speech as a political issue. That really bothers me because, the First Amendment belongs to us on the left. It doesn't belong to you. Like, it's ours, right? You're the Second Amendment people. That's the thing that you love. But, it's funny because, conservatives for years didn't love the First Amendment. These were the people who wanted to ban burning the flag or ban pornography or ban William Burroughs' books or Allen Ginsberg's books or Henry Miller's books. That's what these people were, So these people who've now sort of found it, and I mean, is some of that on the left? Is some of that a fault of the left? Because I think on some level maybe it is, in the sense that did we get too soft on free speech? Did our views change on that? I mean, what's your take on that? Do you think that the left is somewhat responsible for this whole issue?
I guess it depends how you define the left.
Sure.
Because I think neoliberalism has fed into that a little bit because it's almost like a political ideology built on compromise and the most reasonable position, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have like people on that side, like on the right, they start saying, well, we're the free speech party and we can say this and we can say that. And if you stand against us or criticize us, then the centrist almost says, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe you're right. And while the left is over there screaming in the corner, the centrist and the right and the person on the right are like saying, like, maybe the right has the label of free speech. Maybe we're the free speech side now.
What do you mean? What do you mean by the left being in the corner? That there's like too much interfighting? Because I do think that tends to happen a lot.
I think that happens a ton, and I mean, some of it is a bit of a straw man where, the right can say, oh, look at us, we're a cohesive unit, and look at the left, they're eating their own all the time. But there is a level of the left eating their own. We like to be the side of purity, right? Mm-hmm. and if somebody isn't acting in the ways that we consider the most ethical or the purest ways, then we do tend to jump on them. And you can see this on Twitter, actually, with ContraPoints right now. She is or was planning on doing a debate in Vancouver with Blair White, or not a debate, but a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the people that are normally big fans of hers have really jumped on her. So the left does really attack its own when they step out of line, as it were. But so in a sense, they've almost, in many ways, they've removed themselves from the debate. And centrists are often very quick to compromise, which I think speaks to what you were saying earlier about the Overton window.
Mm-hmm.
Because the left is now not even in the window. Like,
yeah, no, that's a fair point. You're absolutely right about that.
The center is now left, and the far religious right is just the right now. And now you have guys like who are the libertarian, pro-corporate guys who talk about free speech and free markets. They're very much and I mean, from a right leaning perspective, not a all encompassing perspective. Those guys are now the center in many ways, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at least for me, I mean, the thing is like, I always pretty much vote solidly Democratic. I've never voted for a Republican ever. I voted for libertarians, mainly. I think the only reason I did was because there was a local election in which the libertarian, this is interesting. There's a local election where I live where there was a libertarian who was pro-choice and a Democrat who was pro-life. And I went with the pro-choice libertarian, mainly just because the right for a woman to choose is a big issue for me. And I have a huge... I think that the Democratic Party should be broad enough to accept pro-life Democrats, but I don't love it. I think the difference is, but anyway, my main point is that, yeah, I know that on some level that I am one of those people who was responsible for fucking up the Overton window, and that's my bad. I mean, I own that. But at the same time, I think the main thing was, especially with first off, dude, I didn't just understand the extent to which the right controlled YouTube. I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, it's bad.
I had no fucking idea. I mean, and a lot of things started to change for me after MythCon. And MythCon was a big moment where I kind of went, something's wrong here. Something's very, very wrong. That there's a group of people who would cheer at an atheist event, at an event that's for like skeptics and critical thinkers and people who value reason. That people would cheer the idea of somebody tweeting out, "I wouldn't even rape you."
Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
No, that was very distressing to me because I felt like, what are we doing? Where are we going here? And at first, my first instinct was just like, no, this can't be there. No, but it really is. There's a problem here.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's not going to be purely solved by just trying to be naive about it anymore. I was just too naive about how pervasive this kind of malicious and quite frankly just gross content and people who are like this. I mean, Sargon is the fucking worst. And again, Rubin describes him as being somebody who's like a part of the new center. Fuck you. No, he is not.
It's not part of my center.
Definitely not a part of my center either. It's an insult to centrists to think that somebody like him, who even though he doesn't say he's part of the alt-right, he is at very least, a far-right identitarian.
Right,
That, and this is what these people do. They don't actually own what they believe. They don't own it. And that makes me mad because it allows for people to fill in the gaps, which I did for a long time with Rubin. I filled in the gaps. And then I realized that, oh, wait, there aren't any gaps anymore. He's just kind of a right-wing shill asshole, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the other big thing is just how fundamentally stupid Rubin is. I mean, I'm sorry. This is going to, on some level, be an episode where I'm going to shit on Dave Rubin a lot because I really do think that he's just bad. He's bad for he's bad for politics. He's bad for political discourse. And it's not to say that he hasn't done good interviews with people, that he hasn't had good guests on his show. He has. And in fact, one thing that's funny is that the guests that he gets through the Learn Liberty thing often tend to be better than the regular guests he gets. Even if I don't agree with them, the people he gets through Learn Liberty tend to be a little bit of more quality. And then because his show is either a few prominent atheists, folks he gets from Learn Liberty, or radical right-wing assholes from YouTube. Like that's really all he gets. And I never really watched the radical assholes from YouTube. I watched a couple, tried to get a sense of what some of this is like.
Yeah.
But, it's just, he is just so fundamentally thick that I have such a hard time with it. And at first I thought, well, maybe he's just, because he's a comedian. He's not somebody who's, this is not his forte. I sort of saw him the way I would look at Joe Rogan, somebody who doesn't have but the motherfucker apparently has a bachelor's degree in political science. You would think that it would require him to think a little bit deeper about some of this stuff, but he never does. He's very impressionable, which is what bothers me. But I'm not surprised because he came out of the Young Turks, which I don't really like the Young Turks either. They're kind of awful in their own right. But what happened with him was he went from the craziness of the Young Turks, but instead of becoming what I think he thinks he is, which is like this centrist, objective, I'm sitting on my ivory tower looking at all the craziness, to just being sort of another right-wing hack.
Yeah, no, you haven't said anything I disagree with yet.
Right on. I'm sorry. This is the Dave Rubin bitch session because I had an issue with him before. So one thing I do have a huge problem with, and this is something that's pervasive a lot online, is the shitting on journalism.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very bothered by the crapping on journalism. I wrote an article a while back on my podcast, which I wrote as a commentary piece, and then I put it up on my website, called In Defense of Journalism. And I talked about how, during the Watergate investigations, the New York Times and the Washington Post got things wrong all the time that they had to retract.
Yeah.
But did that mean that Nixon was what they were fundamentally, that Nixon was innocent? No. And, the other day, there was a big thing about ABC News ran an article about how that basically Jared Kushner had set up the arrangement for Flynn to talk to the Russians. And that it was sort of during, but what they didn't disclose the fact that this was also during the transition, and that Kushner had asked Flynn to not just talk to Russia, but to talk to a bunch of other countries. Right. They didn't really flesh that part in, so they had to make a retraction. And of course, our boy Rubin, he goes on Twitter and does his usual shtick, because man, he knows how to get that Patreon money. And he goes on and he basically goes like, reason number whatever that people don't trust the media. And I saw that. And I tweeted out and I said, cheap, easy Rubin cliche number whatever. Because it's real cheap and it's real easy to kind of shit on journalism and shit on the newspapers and kind of shit on things that they get wrong. But here's the fun fact. The difference between ABC News and somebody like Donald Trump is that when Donald Trump lies and makes shit up or just flat out invents fictions that suit his narrative, and then he's called out for his bullshit, and people tell him that he's objectively wrong, and they show him how he's wrong with facts, he doesn't own that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
At least CNN, when they published the story about the Russia stuff a few months back, and it wasn't fully corroborated, the NBC News had to, not NBC, but CNN had to pull the story, and the journalists who were involved with it resigned. That's right. Being ethical. That's holding journalistic standards. That's what journalism is. Unlike right-wing pundits on YouTube who make money from people who are cozy with the alt-right, like Rubin is.
That's actually been a major issue. Like, I'm a big fan of alternative media. I mean,
Me too.
do a podcast, but there's not that level of accountability that's required.
No.
I mean, some of us try to hold ourselves to a certain level, but if you want to just go online and spew a bunch of lies, you can. But an organization like CNN or NBC or any of these major news organizations, they actually have to have some accountability, and they hold themselves as organizations at this certain level, and they have for decades. And suddenly we're supposed to think that they're worse than the alternative media that is just a bunch of, like you say, right-wing assholes on YouTube spewing nonsense.
Yeah, and that's my main thing, because this is the thing I noticed, especially over the last probably year or so. Once Rubin went independent, especially, is that every episode he has certain things that he ticks, certain boxes that he ticks, so the audience gets excited. For somebody who talks about how bad virtue signaling is, he does it quite a bit. He also loves identity politics, which is the other thing. He talks about how awful identity politics is, but then never shuts the fuck up about being gay married and how much he loves weed and how much he, this and that and the other. Or he'll run a YouTube. Yeah, go ahead.
You'd think a guy who got a bachelor's in political science would recognize that every single thing in politics is a matter of identity. Mm-hmm. And identity politics permeates every single aspect of politics. It's just funny that he and you see that from a lot of people too, actually. Like the identity politics is bad unless you're a Republican, which is an identity.
Exactly.
Or anti-union, which is,
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I read Mark Lilla's book earlier this year about his critique of identity politics, and I share some of those concerns. I mean, my biggest concern about identity politics is not so much identity politics itself, but what I'm concerned with is that there's nothing wrong, I think, with having a certain level of politics that's based in identity. I mean, hell, I do it. I mean, I am an atheist. I vote as an atheist. I vote as a non-religious secular voter. That's a big part of my identity, and it's how I frame how I look at politics. To ignore that and to say that on some level I don't have an identity that feeds into what I think about politics is absurd. But I think that the larger issue here is that we need to make sure that the different identities upon which that we value each other don't push us to lose sight of sort of the bigger picture stuff that we need to work on. So, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the left and sort of inter-party squabbling and that we're always so obsessed with purity. And if somebody's not 100% with me on this particular thing, then they're not an ally. And my thinking on the subject is that the problem sometimes with identity politics is that you don't see the forest for the trees. And you're so obsessed with all these individual things that you're sort of losing part of the big picture, that institutions matter, the political institutions matter, that voting matters, that legislating coalitions matter, that those things are important. And so I hope that, and that's what I was worried about with the left as a thing, was that they were sort of losing sight of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that identity politics is the end of the world. I don't think it is. I just think that we need to understand that there are broad, universal things that we all care about that should sort of unite us. And then when we get some of these bigger picture things done that we all value, then we can go back to discussing some of these minor issues, or not go back to them, but sort of prioritize how we deal with certain issues and think about the sort of the bigger picture.
Right.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
No, I just no, I think there's definitely something to that, though. I think you're right that there's certain uniting characteristics that we should have as leftists or left of center people that should at the very least put us at opposite of the people that are on the right. Mm-hmm. And that is based on the systems of government that we currently have and the voting systems that exist. This is where we have to be informed. I mean, I have a view of the world as I want it to be, and then I have a working model of the world as it is, and we have to work within the model of the world as it is, or we can't reach the world as we want it to be, if that makes sense.
You're absolutely right. I think you've just helped me phrase it in my own head to kind of echo what you've said. One of the things I think that's important is a certain level of pragmatism. That politics is the art of the possible. And, I'm sort of an old school sort of Lyndon Johnson kind of liberal. I believe in building coalition blocks and creating sort of coalition blocks to get things done and deal making. And I don't have a problem with that. Politics is a messy business. It's not perfect. Sometimes it creates bad results. But on the whole, I'm in favor of creating broader victories. And then once you get those victories, if they're not exactly how you want them, right, you go back and you fight for what you want more. That it's better to get 50, 60, 70% of it you want than nothing at all. And, that was how liberals used to be in a lot of ways. And what I worry sometimes with Democrats, at least in my country and with the left sometimes, is they don't have that sort of pragmatic spirit about them, which I understand. I get why they don't necessarily always have that, because they see so much that's wrong with our country, whether it's the abuse of power with law enforcement against African Americans, or the sort of the overreach of the prison industrial complex, which I totally agree with, the problems with the war on drugs, the violations of civil rights, all of this. I totally understand that on some level that will make you angry enough to sort of not see the pragmatism in it. But I think it's important to sort of, have, as you said, have a working model of what you value, what matters to you, and then what actually is going on, and try to find a place where you can gain some victories, because that's the beautiful thing I think about, that's what politics should be about. It should be about finding ways to create and enact policies and social legislation that improve the lives of people. And that's really what it should be about.
Yeah.
And improve our freedom and improve equality and all that. And so, we're going to have times where we disagree, but I think it's very important, I think especially in the age of Trump, to not overlook those disagreements, because I think some of them are genuine and valuable, but to set them aside for the moment and focus on some bigger picture stuff, and then come back to that later, or to prioritize it later.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see the Overton window pull far enough to the left that we can deal with, all these disputes that we have on the left.
Me too.
And address all these issues. But for now, we got to fight against the right and all these. Well, I mean, in the U.S., you guys, I just don't even know what you're going to do. I feel awful for you guys.
Yeah, it's been a really shitty week here in the States. I mean, first off, kudos to you being in Canada. You can kind of go this ain't my fucking mess, which, kudos to you. But yeah, I mean, we've had some serious problems this week. I mean, obviously you had the indictment of Flynn, the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who pled guilty to one charge of lying to authorities, which is interesting because chances are he was probably indicted on multiple charges, but the fact that he's pleading guilty, he's taking a plea deal for one, means he's got dirt on people, which means some other fucker's going down next. And my real hope is that it's Kushner.
Yeah, that's right.
Because this episode's going to be about, between talking about Dave Rubin and talking about Jared Kushner, is talking about stupid privileged white guys who are in way over their head, and which is definitely Dave Rubin. Because have you ever looked? Sometimes he just has dead eyes. I don't really know if he understands what people are saying to him. And Jared Kushner, I think, is the same way. John Oliver did a piece a while back, I think last summer, about Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, and talked about how, there was somebody who was quoted as saying, Jared Kushner doesn't have a lot up in his head to clutter his mind, And I thought, that's a compliment. That's awesome. But because if you ever look at any time the Trump Russia shit happens. If you look at any time something bad happens with the Trump and Russia investigation, almost every time it involves Jared Kushner. Almost every time it involves him doing something stupid. So there's that. Then, of course, you had the massive passage of the tax overhaul here in this country, which is going to drastically hurt the middle class.
Oh, geez.
It's going to redistribute.
That is so damaging.
Yep. It's going to redistribute $1 trillion to the wealthiest Americans. It's going to blow up deficits. So the next time that a Republican wants to tell you they care about deficits and debt and this and that and the other, go tell them to fuck themselves because they're lying sacks of shit. They don't care about deficits. Or if they do, they don't have the courage to stand up for it. Paul Ryan loves charts. Maybe he should make a chart about how just truly up Donald Trump's ass he is. I mean, that would be fantastic. But spineless motherfucker, dude works out all week, can't seem to find a spine. But anyway, so I will say to my listeners though, listen, not all is lost on the tax thing. So it's passed out of the Senate. The House and Senate versions now have to reconcile themselves. So the House has to pass another version that's in keeping with the Senate version before it gets to Trump's desk. So it can die. I mean, the thing is, like, this has wide unpopularity in the American electorate, and yet they do it anyway. It's remarkable. And then I love how people...
That's the same with net neutrality, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there was that report about how 1 million filings with the FCC, how like 1 million petitions that were filed on the FCC websites were basically bots that they were put together through Comcast or whatever. Like if you actually match them up, all the text is the same, and there was like a mass. I don't know what you would describe it as, like a mass petitioning that was done by bots. So
yeah, like a form letter.
Yeah, like a form letter, basically. Yeah.
Right.
So when people want to say things like, man, I just didn't trust Hillary. Look, I didn't really trust Hillary either. But at the end of the day, here's a fun fact. If Hillary was president, Gorsuch wouldn't be on the court. If Hillary was president, we wouldn't have to worry about taxes like this. If Hillary was president, we wouldn't have public leaders at the national level, suck up to a fucking autocrat in Russia. I mean, these are the things. I mean, yeah, she was imperfect, but Jesus Christ, that does not excuse the fact that Donald Trump is the worst president in modern history, period. And I thought I could never say that. I never thought that anybody could be worse than Bush. Never thought anybody could be worse than Bush. Hell, Trump makes Bush look normal, which is fucking weird. Absolutely weird. But you guys have like the young, cool prime minister. I mean, damn, it sucks.
Yeah, sort of. I know a lot of people complain about him. And honestly, he's a little too far right for my tastes. Mm-hmm. But the people in Canada who voted for Justin Trudeau voted because we needed to beat our conservative candidate. We needed to get the right out of government. So we bit the bullet and we did what we had to.
Yeah, and sometimes that's all you can do. I mean, in the choice between a few more years of Stephen Harper and Trudeau, yeah, I mean that's easy. Harper was a joke.
No-brainer, really.
Yeah, Harper was a joke. But anyway, I mean, my big thing is that we have so many huge problems in the world, and the big thing that I've seen that really bothers me, and I think it's one of the biggest issues of our time, and I would put it up there with income inequality or climate change, is this retreat of liberal democracy and this sort of ascendance of authoritarianism. It's something that really bothers me, and especially right authoritarianism. And, in this country, you see the rise of white supremacists and the alt-right. In Germany, you're seeing, you had that huge protest that happened in Poland a few weeks ago of far-right nationalists. And what really bothers me about people who I thought were cool, people who I thought were valuable to sort of changing the public discourse and making it more civil and making it more about the common good and the greater good, and is that that's not what was actually going on. I mean, when you host on your show somebody like Dave Rubin, I'm talking about Dave Rubin again. I can't help it.
Right.
When you have somebody on your show like Lauren Southern, and she's sitting there and she's giving you apologetics on Richard Spencer, and you say nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, fuck you. Like, you should not be comfortable with that. You know, you should not be comfortable with somebody on your show coming on and talking about some crazy racist bullshit like the Great Replacement and think that that's acceptable. That's what drives me crazy. It's not inherently a problem hosting these people. It's a problem if you host them and you don't actually fucking ask them questions, tough questions, or do just a modicum of research on some of the shit they're talking about and genuinely ask them criticism, rather than just soft pedaling and doing your little stupid shtick that you do. That makes me angry. That makes me so angry. That's what broke me. That's what broke me. I was like, no, you're not going to do this anymore. Or if you're going to do it, I'm not listening anymore. You lost a fucking listener. And there's a lot of us people on the internet. I've been reading about this. There's a lot of people, especially on Twitter. There's a lot of people who are ex-Rubin fans who just give him so much shit whenever he tweets anything. It's beautiful. Read the threads. Oh, mwah, it's delicious. Yeah. But you know, again, I'm saying this as a guy who's pretty much not changed my political views. I've just gotten tired of the fact that here I am, kind of a, I don't know what you would call me, pretty, I'm an FDR liberal. I'm an LBJ Great Society liberal. I'm an Obama liberal. And this is where I stand. And you have this shit just shifting to the right. And I'm standing over here going like, what is going on? Like that drives me crazy, man. And I just should not have been as crazy about it. But anyway, it's
no, that's fair.
Because it bothers me, because I think one of the big problems in our political discourse is the fact that there is a real lack of civility. Some of that's, I think, justified. In the sense that when you have somebody like, because, there's really nobody in politics I hate more than Mitch McConnell. I hate Mitch McConnell so much. I feel like he's done almost irreparable damage to our country. He is somebody who really just broke normal procedure with the Senate. And you can see it in the way they passed this tax bill. I mean, they passed it at 2 a.m. They had to pass it with Pence. Pence had to come in to break the tie. So the only two major victories that they've had this year, which is the appointment of Gorsuch and this, they've had both times to bring in, they had to bring in Pence both times to get him done. And they not only did they pass a nearly 500-page bill in the middle of the night after very little debate on the bill, but they were handwritten amendments that were written in the margins. That's an insult to democracy.
Actually,
what?
Because I just read a headline that said that there was handwritten parts to it that, like, how does that work? Like, how can it be like last minute filled in with your pen? Like, it doesn't make sense.
it's pretty gross. And Senate Democrats, to their credit, said, can we wait till Monday? Can we deliberate on the bill, read it, and vote on Monday? And Republicans said no. And even Bob Corker, who is the senator, I think, from Tennessee, who's not running for re-election. So he voted no on the bill, but he voted yes on moving the debate to the floor. He voted to make sure that it was on the floor on Friday. And so, my big problem is that this is a huge erosion of democracy. This is how autocracies work.
Yeah.
This is how authoritarianism works. And for people who are listening who are saying the Democrats did the same thing with the Affordable Care Act, here's what I'm going to say to you about that. That's a real false equivalency. The Democrats spent 16 months working on the Affordable Care Act. Yes, some of it was written in secret. Yes, some of it was written in back rooms. Yes, some huge portions of it were written by the insurance industry and by lobbyists. Having said all of that, the Democrats made every version of that bill as public as they possibly could. And there were multiple town halls. There were multiple hearings. Republicans added amendments, even when they didn't vote for the bill. And it was as transparent as a process as a major piece of legislation could be. It's, don't compare what they did with the Affordable Care Act to this. It's not the same thing. It's not. But what I will say is, if you do think that the Affordable Care Act paved the way for this, then Republicans should have had a spine and not done this kind of thing. If they were so worried about the way the Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act, they shouldn't have done the exact same thing on steroids. And that's what I'm bothered by. It's this lack of principle. These people have no principles. They have no actual internal values of governing. And that drives me fucking nuts. It makes me so angry to just subvert the will of the people and who democratically elected you, and to just do whatever the fuck you want, simply by virtue of the fact that your donor class is going to be happy with it. That pisses me off. That is a subversion of democracy.
So, I think you nailed it.
Sorry, man. But
that's a good rant. I appreciate a good rant.
I mean, it's frustrating to be in America. And, for example, I went to graduate school, and I have student loan debt from my graduate school. I don't have any student loan debt from my bachelor's degree. And I don't have a lot of student loan debt. It's not much. It's basically, if you add interest and everything, it's somewhere around $17,000. That's pretty much it. It's almost nothing. But I was really looking forward to this coming year being able to file my taxes and receive the tax credit that I would get on the student loan interest that I paid.
Yeah.
Well, the House version of the tax bill would do away with that. So I wouldn't get that money anymore. Now, the thing they say is, it's doubling the standard deduction. Well, it's just fine. So yeah, Americans will get more in a tax refund, but overall they're still going to have to, but the fact that they're getting more with their standard deduction at the end of the year, but they're not getting the government services because there's no money for them. The fact that 13 million Americans are likely to lose their health insurance because of this. The fact that this version of the bill repealed the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, which is one of the big components to making that law work. You need the individual mandate to make the law work. That's how it works. When you do away with that, then the marketplaces have problems. It just goes to show that there's a real lack of they just don't care. And that's what makes me mad. It just seems to me like they don't care. I mean, is there anything comparable to this going on in Canada? I probably imagine not. But is there anything right now that's controversial that's going on in Canada that's a problem?
Not really.
Good for you. Thanks for rubbing it in, fucker.
The thing is, actually, right now our politics are so quiet and so lame. And there's a little back and forth. The conservative side of things really wants to vilify Justin Trudeau. And we do have a third viable party, the New Democratic Party, that I feel is more in line with much of Canada's viewpoint. But so there is the kind of a couple parties that are trying to hey, the Liberals suck, and this is why. And there is a little bit of corruption going on with our finance minister, but I don't know the details of it because it's so tame compared to what's going on down south.
Yeah. You described your politics as being quiet and lame. I would take quiet and lame in a heartbeat.
Yeah,
please.
That's right.
I would take quiet and lame in a heartbeat. So let's pivot a little bit. So we've talked a lot about, my hatred for Dave Rubin's bullshit, which thank you for letting me just get that out. I needed to get it out. I needed to have somebody understand where I'm coming from. So we've talked a lot about my views on politics. What really are yours, and what are some of the things that you think? You were talking about earlier about some of the practical goals. What are some of the practical things about what you believe that you think you could maybe get done in Canada, or things that maybe even be viable in the United States?
Well, I don't know how viable anything is in the U.S. right now, but
not much.
In Canada, I'd like to see a little bit more worker protection. Like, I'd like to see stronger unions. I know a lot of people don't like unions, but that's my position. I'm a pro-union guy.
Me too.
I would like to see, better safety regulations. Our education, at least in my province, is facing some real issues because our provincial government decided to spend a bunch of money on a new highway around the city of Regina, and it cost. There's some issues with that too, because they paid, like, I think it was 1,000% more for the land than it was actually worth.
Oh, Jesus.
So
wow.
And it just happened to go through this guy who knows a guy who knows the finance minister of the province.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, locally, I'd like to see a lot more free housing, because there's programs where the homeless get given a house through this Housing First program.
That's cool.
And they find that within a few months, these people have solid jobs. They have entered into rehab programs because they have this secure housing that they don't have to worry about losing if something goes wrong with them. It's that's that far left kind of give people things.
Well, I mean,
a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, it's how did Lyndon, I'm trying to remember how Lyndon Johnson described it. He said, give people a hug and a lot of money. And
Yeah.
And I'm actually not opposed to that. I mean, ironically enough, in the state of Utah, they have sort of a pilot project that's similar to what you've described. With folks, and trying to find ways of providing housing for homeless people, and how this actually improves their economic lot. It's a classic cliche where people say, talk about, raising yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's very easy to not be able to do that when you don't have the boots. And that's really the important thing is, and which is a real bummer, because the person who articulated this recently, who articulated it very, very well, is Al Franken, which is a stolid bummer. But he made a point of, like, that's what we Democrats do. We provide the boots. And I like that. That the thing I think that's very important is there's a philosopher that was very influential on me. I read him in undergrad. He's a guy named Karl Polanyi, and he wrote a book called The Great Transformation. And he talked about how one of the problems of modern economics is that it divorces it from politics. Okay. And that, when the study of economics sort of got off the ground, it was originally described as political economy. And what Polanyi's great insight is, and I think he's right, is the idea that the market, like when we talk about the market, right? The market that we use every day, whether it's, in Canada or in the States, the market is a construction of government. It's not something that exists sort of naturally. Now, that's sort of counterintuitive to hear. A lot of people be like, well, a free market. It really isn't such a thing as a free market, right? So, governments are inherently important for the value of creating a marketplace, right? So they create a uniform medium of exchange. That's what currency is. They create rules and regulations by which people create and facilitate contracts, the way they facilitate trade, arbitrations between people with disagreements. This is what governments do. And so Polanyi makes the insight, and it seems obvious on the first surface, but I think it's actually quite good, is that governments exist in order to facilitate the means by which we create markets that work effectively for people. And when they don't work effectively for people, we need social programs and we need social institutions that shore up what markets can't do.
Right.
And that's what I believe. I mean, that's generally what I believe. And so, and so, it's about creating a sort of a true hybrid system between what private industry can achieve, because the beauty of private industry is the creation of wealth. It's it's dynamism, it's innovation, it's entrepreneurship. These are all good things about markets. These are the good things about capitalism. But there's a lot of bad about capitalism in terms of, rampant inequality, the overemphasis on capital instead of on labor. There's certain issues that don't always get solved by a market mechanism. For example, Vox.com. I love Vox. I don't know if you follow Vox or not. But here in the States, I love Ezra Klein. I think he's great. And in many ways, I'm sort of a Vox Democrat. I love those guys over there. Their positions are pretty close to mine. So maybe I am more left than I say I am. Who knows? But
it's starting to sound like
he did a great video about healthcare spending around the world in the industrialized countries. And he talks about how let's separate private and public spending. If you look at it on a chart, the United States actually spends pretty close to what other countries do on public spending. So that's like the VA, Medicare, Medicaid. It's in the private markets that our costs explode. And there's a reason for that. So the reason that Medicare can keep costs down is because it's an institution who serves as an arbitrator between the consumers of healthcare and the producers of it. So they have the ability to sort of put pressure on the insurance, non-insurance, but on hospitals to keep procedures lower than they would be for private insurance. They have the arbitration power to lower prescription drug costs. That's what they do. But individuals in a market like me, like my wife and I have private insurance. We have private insurance through her employer. We don't have that level of, we don't have that amount of leverage because the insurance industry that we're a part of is one of many insurance providers, and they're all competing against each other for arbitration power. And therefore they don't have the kind of power that Medicaid has or Medicare has. And wouldn't it be great in the United States if we had like a single payer or a sort of Medicare for all scheme where people could come into it and it could be public insurance that could give the public a certain level of arbitration power for prescription drug costs and for hospital visits and things like that. So this is where I think, I'm not anti-government. This is actually where I think government involvement in things can actually lead to better outcomes and to cheaper ones, which I know sounds counterintuitive to people. But if you look at it on the whole, our public spending on healthcare is pretty much close to what it is in the rest of the industrialized world. It's the private part that has just exploded. These are things that I don't know. It's at the end of the day, for me, it's about sort of trying to figure out better ways to do stuff and try to figure out how, maybe there is a better way of doing this that's part of private industry, and maybe there's really not. And sometimes we should do a public version of it, and then sort of modify it depending upon the situation. So that's kind of my take on things generally, but I keep saying my take and I'm not letting you say your take. So I'm sorry. Please continue.
It's like being in Canada, I have a slightly different take on obviously healthcare because we have single payer. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have insurance companies that supplement your drugs and your eyewear and whatnot. And dental work isn't covered. But if you need a surgery, you go to the hospital and you get a surgery. And I mean, for me, it seems so obvious that that's the right way to do things that I have trouble really wrapping my head around anybody who disagrees with that.
Yeah. Well, here's one thing, I guess, is here in the United States. So I can give you a brief rundown on why our healthcare system is so convoluted and complicated. Part of it has to do with the fact that during World War II, there were wage controls that were set by the federal government, where you were as a wage cap, you couldn't be paid over a certain amount. But employers actually wanted to pay more than what they were being allowed to by the federal government. So they developed a system of benefits that would sort of be a way to have and provide an additional income in terms of wages for their employees, but not be subject to the wage caps. So say, for example, you made $10 an hour and your employer actually wanted to pay you $13. So you'd get $10 in a wage and you'd get $3 in benefits. And that's how the employee-based health system really came to fruition here in the United States. Before that, most healthcare services, in terms of sort of insurance, or at least what we'd think of being as insurance, a lot of it was actually done through fraternal or sorority organizations. So if you belonged to like the local VFW, the VFW wasn't around back then. You would have been like the Knights of Pythias or some shit. That you could actually get your health insurance through your fraternal organization that you belong to. And they used to buy group plans. And that's how that used to sort of be in the private market. But after World War II, the wage controls went away, but the employer-employee based benefit system continued. And as it continued, it got obviously things get more expensive over time, and workers demanded more from their employers. And so you got into a joint system between the employee paying part of it and the employer paying part of that, which is very similar to what Germany does too. Where Germany has, so like you guys have like universal healthcare. Germany has what you would describe as being like socialized medicine, where you have, publicly set prices for like, medicines or surgeries or whatever, but then your insurance is provided largely through your employer. And that's kind of how Germany works. The United States is similar in that regard. And then as it evolved over the years, then you had the emergence of Medicare and Medicaid in the mid-1960s as a part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. So Medicaid helps take care of the poor. It also does poor low-income people, but it also actually takes care of some seniors, particularly those in nursing homes. Nursing home coverage is interesting how it works through Medicaid. It's very, very interesting. And then you have Medicare, which is for people who are 65 and older, or I think that's it, 65 and older. And then you have the VA, the Veterans Administration, which is for soldiers. So here in the United States, we have universal health care for old people, we have universal health care for poor people, and we have universal health care for veterans. And we actually do have universal paid for health care for one organ in the body, and that is kidneys.
Interesting.
John Oliver actually did a good piece about this a while back about kidney dialysis. In the early 1970s, the Nixon administration with Congress passed a bill that provided universal health coverage for people with renal failure, so people who needed dialysis. Here in the United States, if you have renal failure and you need dialysis, that's covered by the public. So if you have a problem with one of your organs, that's universal. It's very strange.
That is very strange.
So the thing about the United States is, instead of doing what a lot of industrialized countries did, whether it was Canada or the UK in 1948 with NHS, is that we have this very interesting public-private system where nearly half of every healthcare dollar spent in the United States is public. The other half is private. And that just leads to so many more third parties being a part of the take. So that's where the costs get high, because you have administrators have to get a take, hospitals have to get a take, doctors have to get a take, pharmaceutical companies have to get a take, government has to get a take. When you have so many sort of hands in the cookie jar, it's no surprise that it's harder to deal with some of that issues. And the Affordable Care Act worked on trying to curb some of this spending. And if you actually look at per capita as a GDP, the Affordable Care Act was actually fixing some of these problems until Republicans blew it up. And so what I would like to see in this country is I like the idea of what Bernie Sanders talks about, the idea of Medicare for all. I think Medicare should just be a universal health care option for all Americans. I would dissolve Medicaid into Medicare and make Medicare the public health option for all Americans. And that you could do like a phase-out system where you would phase out Medicare and have it go into Medicaid, and you have to go into Medicare. And you'd have to do the way you would do it is you would have to raise taxes, which I'm not opposed to doing. I mean, trust me, we're in fantasy land at this point. But but what you would do is you would basically raise some certain taxes. You would still allow private insurance as a supplement to whatever the government gives you, which is what most industrialized countries do. I know Canada does, for example, where you can buy a supplemental insurance plan. And that's what they do with Medicare anyway. In the United States, you can buy a supplemental plan. My grandma's on Medicare, and she buys a supplemental plan through AARP. And so that's one way you could do it. And yeah, it would be expensive, but I think it would be valuable in a way of being able to get us closer to what I think is important, which is universal health care coverage. But, the fact that the Republicans passed this bill this week, which is going to basically, it's going to destabilize the ACA markets. It's going to rip people from Medicare and Medicaid over 10 years. It's just ridiculous. I don't understand it. But they're not doing it with deficits. I mean, that's what makes me mad. They're always talking about how much they love, we need to bring down the debt. I mean, trust me, they had such a fucking hard on for doing that when Obama was president. But yet it's like when they do it, fucking crickets.
Yeah.
It's the hypocrisy, man.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the hypocrisy, man. So, before you had talked about, when on my previous show you were on, you talked about you were an anarcho-syndicalist. I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit, because I'd love to hear your take on that and how you kind of came to that position and what you think is valuable to that particular version of political philosophy. Sure.
Well, I guess a good place to start is like with anarchism.
Okay.
Because I kind of came to anarchism through libertarianism.
Okay.
Because I was kind of conservative for a while in my 20s, and slowly but surely I kind of converted into like this almost a pendulette type libertarian.
I had that period too. I was an objectivist for a while. So
right. So then, but it seemed quite off to me that the libertarian model is very trading the tyranny of government for the tyranny of corporations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I started exploring like anarchism, which is essentially just the people rule.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, it's a very vague idea, and obviously it's political philosophy, so there's a lot more to it. But
of course,
but essentially, the idea of anarchism is that any form of or any power structure that places people in charge of one another must be able to justify itself and must be able to be not actually putting people above each other. Everybody should be on the same plane in a way, but certain people are assigned certain tasks based on what their strengths are. The syndicalism part of anarchism is about unions and worker groups in a way. So an anarcho-syndicalist in a very, I guess, two-sentence type of way is a philosophy that says society should be run by the workers and unions should be the representatives of those workers as the government.
Okay.
If that makes so, it is essentially it's socialism, but with unions running the society.
Okay. So one of the big things that I think is interesting about that. So my knowledge of anarchism comes from a couple people that I've read. One is Peter Kropotkin, who I read in college, and Emma Goldman. I love Emma Goldman. I have a huge Emma Goldman poster actually in my room. That's done by a Chicago artist. It's pretty punk rock. I love it. Her writings on atheism are awesome, by the way. I've been talking about doing an article for my blog about her views on atheism, which are really fucking great. She said, she has a great quote. She's like, "I do not believe in God because I believe in man." And I just really like that. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let me ask you this. So one of the things that Steven Pinker talks about in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is something called the civilizing process, which is a phrase that he got from another social science scholar. But he talks about the idea that one of the big ways in which modern societies became more civil with one another was the institution of central governments. So we went away from sort of a fiefdom system in the Middle Ages in Europe, where you had all these like little fiefdoms who fought one another because there was no central authority. And it moved to a central authority, meaning, as Max Weber would say, the monopoly on the use of force, which is, because that is all that government is. Government is organized force. And when we're talking about politics, what we're talking about is what we're comfortable with getting done using force. And so, how does anarcho-syndicalism deal with this issue of force, and how do you enforce things? Is it predicated on the model of sort of the non-aggression axiom? Where do you get that sort of, I guess, how do you solve sort of what I would call the Hobbesian nightmare, I guess?
It's sort of like, I never really had a good answer for this until fairly recently.
Okay.
and I'm not even sure if this is really the right answer, but it's very much there's a group out there right now that's working towards what they call civilian-led policing.
Okay.
And it's very much a system where certain people are placed in positions like police, and they have to be rotated in through a system of checks and balances. And I mean, they kind of laid it out for me a little bit when I talked on the phone with their the president of their group, but it's not really easy to explain.
Of course.
But essentially it's a system where people come from the regular everyday people and involve themselves in a selection process where they then become police, or they become what I guess would be police chiefs in this, I guess would be the best way to word it, like somebody who would be in charge of the police. And these people would then be accountable to the community by this rotation and selection process.
That's very interesting. So in terms of being held accountable by the public, would that basically be like a voting system? Yeah,
they kind of presented it as a voting system, but I'm not entirely sure that would be the best way to do it.
Okay.
I'm not, because elections, it's hard. I guess it's hard to say this will work necessarily based on the way that society is running now, because elections often, they get into these what appeals to the lowest common denominator type scenarios, and elections aren't often the best way to get people into certain positions.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah, especially what we do here in the United States, where, because we live in a republic. I mean, I know that people talk all the time about how the United States is democracy. In some respects, in the small d sense, yes, it's democracy. But it's not a big D democracy. It's a republic. And so there's a certain level of separation between what the public chooses and what the government does, in the sense that with the Electoral College, it's a check upon the public. And if you read the Federalist Papers, you read Hamilton or Madison, that's exactly how they describe it, that sometimes the public doesn't always do what's in their self-interest. And so what the Electoral College is, it's supposed to be a check upon the public. Apparently it didn't really work this time around, but or the time before that. But, because the last two times this system worked the way it was supposed to, in its ideal way, we got George W. Bush and Donald Trump. So,
right.
Trust me, I'm a huge fan of Alexander Hamilton. He may have fucked up on this one. So I guess my follow-up question would be then is, with what you're describing is, I'm assuming, is a stateless society, that the state is gone. Essentially. So does it have an emphasis on localism? Was what happens locally the most important thing? How do you figure out how different locales work with one another? Is there a possibility of how would you work in terms of figuring out? My biggest question, I would say, is working out the anarcho-syndicalist foreign policy. How do you interact with other societies, especially ones across borders and across oceans?
Yeah, see, it's interesting because I recently had a conversation with somebody who was describing a system of government to me where people would be assigned based on their education to certain roles. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, this would have to be some sort of centralized unit that everybody could, like the surrounding localized groups would have to agree on. Mm-hmm. In what would probably appear to be a very democratic system. I wonder, in a lot of ways, democracy and anarcho-syndicalism would look very similar on the larger scale, because you do need a group that is specialized in dealing with foreign countries to deal with that situation.
Okay.
I think that part of the issue that we're facing in democracy right now is that the political class, as it were, is often placed above the other working classes.
I think that's true. Yeah.
And I mean, I kind of feel like anarcho-syndicalism is this working model of society that isn't fully fleshed out, obviously, and may not ever really work with the society or evolve from the society that we currently have, because of the class system that we already have in place. But by and large, I think that the further we move towards socialism, the better off we are in many ways.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. And
Sure.
One thing that you hear a lot about when you hear socialism, because it's the boogeyman. I mean, there are versions of socialism that genuinely suck. I mean, the Soviet Union was awful. Communist China under Mao, I call him Meow like a cat. Mao is awful. Nice. Was awful. And most recently, what we've seen in Venezuela. And what makes an anarcho-syndicalism's version of socialism different from, say, what a country like Venezuela has done, or what what other socialist governments have done before? One of the things that you'll often hear on the right, and some of it I think maybe be justified, I think some of it is that one of the problems with socialism, when it's taken to its extreme, is that you do have a real loss of freedom. You have a real loss of choice, that you have a real loss of sort of some levels of small d democracy, and that autocracies and sort of authoritarianism become sort of the default setting, because that's the way you sort of, that's how you square the circle, because you can't do it otherwise. How does anarcho-syndicalism sort of deal with these critiques or these criticisms? Because that's one thing I'm always interested in is how do we balance a society's need for dynamism and entrepreneurship and wealth creation and innovation with with some levels of sort of social security, stability, and safety? How do we balance those out?
Yeah, actually, I just got shared a new study. Well, I don't know if the study is new, but I just recently got a study shared with me that I haven't had a chance to read yet, that actually addresses some of the questions surrounding socialism as it's been practiced in the world. And so I hope to take a look at that soon. But I think that often the characterization of socialism as as authoritarian is a bit I think it misses what actually socialism is supposed to be.
You think it's a bit of a red herring the way they phrase it?
Yeah,
then? Okay.
That's right. Because the idea that the power of government is in the hands of the working class seems, and the capital should be given to those who produce things, seems to me to be actually almost a more free society in a sense, because everybody can then afford to buy the things that they produce.
Yeah, that was Polanyi's argument too, even though he wasn't an anarcho-syndicalist.
Right.
This is where you get into a classic thing within political philosophy, the idea of you have negative liberties and positive liberties. One of the things that social democracies do is that they champion both. So if you look at FDR's Four Freedoms. So FDR gave a speech in 1941, right before World War II started, where he advocated for something called the Four Freedoms, which I actually have on my wall. I love the Four Freedoms. It's kind of how I view political philosophy, actually. It's kind of my view of the world.
Okay.
There's four freedoms, and there's freedom of speech, freedom of worship. Those are the first two. Those are negative liberties, meaning that the government can't take them away from you. The government is there to provide protection against those who would violate those freedoms. And then the other two are the interesting ones: freedom from want and freedom from fear. What freedom from want is exactly what you've described, is creating an economic condition by which people can live lives of productivity and happiness. So by creating a society in which you give people the means, or you find ways for them to provide the means for themselves, that you can then give them a greater birth of freedom. This is the positive freedom argument. And then freedom from fear, which is to have a foreign policy which prizes human dignity and human rights above all else. And those are the four main freedoms. And eventually FDR would articulate them in what he called the Second Bill of Rights, where he talked about how everybody should have a right to a job, everybody should have a right to a home, everybody should have a right to clothing and food. That these are positive liberties. Now, if you talk to conservatives, they will argue that positive liberties don't exist, that positive liberties, all they do is they seek to undermine negative liberties, that in trying to institute positive liberties, you actually hurt negative liberties. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think, for me, a good society, the free and open society that I would advocate for, my ideal world, would be one in which we have a balance between positive liberties and negative liberties. So you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of worship, you have freedom to associate, you have all the freedoms that are codified in the Bill of Rights, the government can't take away from you. But on top of that it's the government's role, or it's society's role. It's a mix of both, whether it's public or private means. It's our role to then provide the material needs for people in order to give them a different growth of freedom. Because there is the tyranny of poverty. There's the tyranny of that exists with that. It's like, as James Baldwin said, it's very expensive to be poor. Yeah. And so when you have a society, whether you do it through a more direct market means, or you do it through more of a socialist means, you do one that advocates for a certain level of positive liberty, where you're actually creating a better society that actually is giving people more freedom. So that is very much, it sounds to me from what you're describing with anarcho-syndicalism, that it does really have an emphasis on positive rights and positive liberties.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. The idea that I think often the people who I guess I shouldn't even say that. I was just thinking, like, the people who often argue against positive rights, like you say, like, they've never experienced the being a poor person and how oppressive that actually is.
That's true. I think a lot of them have no concept of it. Yeah.
But I mean, that's maybe not a fair generalization to make. So I don't necessarily want to.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, because for me, the thing that I'm obsessed with as an atheist, one of the things that's very important to me, and it's part of why I do this show and part of why I love having conversations with folks like you, is that, once we've let go of our belief in God, once we've sort of let go of religion and superstition, that one of the big things I think that's important is, how do we build societies that allow for human flourishing? How can we build societies that are secular and humanistic, that replace all of the quote unquote good things that religion does? Which again, I don't think what the good that religion does is because of religion. It's because of people who are organized under institutions of religion. And what I advocate for is a society in which we replace those religious institutions with secular ones. And so, how do we live the good life? How do we build the just and good society? Those are questions that I'm obsessed with. And, to try to bring it a little full circle, there were people who I thought were really interested in those kinds of questions, who turned out to just kind of be not very interested in it. And they're not very interested in having those deeper conversations with people who may disagree with them. And that's really, I think, the disappointment in some of what I see in sort of the YouTube space or whatever, just to sort of bring it full circle. But that's what obsesses me about these questions, why I love politics, why I love political philosophy, is that I'm obsessed with how do we create a better world, because I don't think religion is the way to do it.
No, I totally, yeah, I'm in full agreement. I find, like, I'm not sure I represented the ideas of anarcho-syndicalism very well. I know that there's many people who have written about these things and they're much better at it than I am.
Right on.
But I do think that it's, and my own humility requires me to say that I could definitely be wrong about the virtues of the system I envision. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely flaws that I'm probably not seeing. And I'm fully open to hearing about those. And like you say, like, you asked me some questions that I had to think about pretty quick. And I appreciate that. I appreciate these kinds of conversations where not all the answers are apparent, and we may not necessarily see things exactly the same way. But the goal is that we are working towards a better society. And I think that, like you say, like, it is disappointing to see people on YouTube who don't appear to have that as their goal. They're very much happy with the way things are, and they think that working towards anything better is actually trying to tear down all of society. And I don't think that, though, I think that that's an incorrect view of what I'm trying to do, or what you're trying to do, or what leftists in general are trying to do.
I think that's right. I agree with you, because I fell into that sort of similar trap with talking about my issues with, like, the progressive left, or like SJWs. Now, I don't really necessarily identify as an SJW. I just identify as a liberal. I'm just a liberal. But there's a lot in which SJWs and I actually agree on a lot of things. I actually think that political and social equality for women and for trans people and for the LGBT community is a good thing. I think it's a huge problem when we sort of champion people who think that it's okay to misgender people simply because they just want to be assholes about it. I think that's really shitty. But, and the thing too is, like, and this is the thing about Rubin, and especially Gad Saad, who is infamous about this,
he's awful.
Oh, he's the fucking worst. He's one of those dudes too who I liked at first. I thought was cool, and then he just lost his goddamn mind. The other big thing about these people, and especially Gad Saad, and especially Dave Rubin and these folks, is they have a real obsession with fame. They want to be famous. Like, they want to be famous. They want to have people love them. They want to be successful. They want to be famous. Which is why all the time, like with Gad Saad or whatever, well, he'll like tweet some big famous person and say, hey, come on my show. Well, they're not going to come on your show, motherfucker. First off, they don't know who you are. And if they did, they wouldn't care. Like when Dave Rubin did this like Q&A back in December or whatever, he's like, I'll have Hillary on my show, please. That's just cheap. You're not going to have Hillary on your show.
She is not going on your show.
She is not going on your show. She doesn't know who you are. You aren't worth scraping the shit off her shoes. I mean, like, let's just be real. And so, that's my main thing, is that there's this obsession with celebrity. But anyway, what I was going to say was that, like, when they like criticize like the left, or they criticize SJWs, they tend to pick the worst examples and then they sort of straw man the hell out of it, which, there's a lot of like blue-haired dipshits on YouTube saying crazy shit. Like, that's YouTube. Like, but what you should do is, instead, if you have a huge problem with like certain things, which I do. I mean, I've been critical on my show of sometimes people taking, identity politics too far, or people who take postmodernism too far. The best way to take it is to find the absolute best version of that argument and then criticize that. Yeah, like that's right. Exactly what you should do. Because and they don't do that. That's what makes me mad. They do not do that.
Yeah. I recently heard a video on YouTube from somebody that I can't remember the name of, but they were very interested in steel manning the Nazi position.
Oh, sweet Jesus.
But they never have afforded the same strength to the arguments of the SJWs that they constantly complain about.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's sort of the tyranny of low expectations, as I call it, where they are so obsessed with when some uppity college kid screams. Which again, like, yeah, sometimes there's going to be uppity, bratty college kids. They're 18.
Kids are shitty.
Kids are shitty. And they're young and they're idealistic and they're angry. But my point is that, like, it's so easy to like, for example, like the meme of Trigglypuff, right? You've seen the meme of Trigglypuff. Most people have seen it. The very large student who's in the crowd. I think it was at a Milo talk and she's like screaming or whatever. Shut him down, shut him down. Yeah. And it's so easy to like laugh at her and make her a meme and like whatever. But that's not really like the best. That's not the best way to describe that frame of mind. Like, you can pick other people who are very interesting to listen to. Like, within the atheist movement, I think one of the most articulate champions of social justice that is worth listening to, that Dave should have on his show if he wants to really be about the marketplace of ideas, is Sincere Carabo. Who I really like, and he's a friend of mine, and I've helped him with things before. And I mean, I don't always agree with him, but I totally champion what he's trying to do because, he is exactly, I think, one of the better versions of that side of the argument. And I think he's worth listening to. Sikivu Hutchinson is another one who should be listened to. Those are the people who are atheists who Dave could have on his show who represent the best version of that argument.
Yep.
Will you, Dave? I'm not holding my breath.
I wonder, like the girl in the meme.
Yeah.
I wonder if a person like actually sat down and talked to her, if there might be more to what she's saying. Like the fact that she's memed and has become a caricature of the SJW. Mm-hmm. I mean, myself, I would want to talk to her and hear her viewpoints before I ever, or listen to maybe some content that she produces sometime if she did that.
Yeah. And I think that's totally fair. I think what we should be doing is, and this is one of the big things I think that's very important about classical liberalism, which Rubin doesn't give a fuck about, that's a component to it, which I think is important, is the principle of charity. In that you should give as good as you get. So if people are legitimately giving you fair and honest criticism about what you have to say, you can't just shrug them off as being trolls or SJWs or cooks or whatever stupid shit you want to call them, and legitimately respond to them in the way that you think is appropriate. If they're doing that for you, like that, and that's really my issue. Like, for example, Nightmare Fuel is a great YouTuber who goes after fucking Rubin. I've talked about him before tonight on this episode. He's asked Rubin multiple times to like talk to him or gives him legitimate, honest criticism, and Rubin blocked him and called him a troll. And that was it. And I'm like, he's not a troll. He's legitimately asking you serious questions about how you do your show and who you are as a human being and as a thinker in this space. And you're just going to call him a troll and ignore him. Like, that's cheap. Like, that's not acting out of a principle of charity. That's not actually valuing the open marketplace of ideas. That's not actually valuing free speech, because you just don't really give it, and that's what just drives me crazy, is like, that's what people should be doing. Yeah, there are times where I disagree with a lot of the SJW stuff. Of course, who the fuck doesn't? But that doesn't mean like the alt-right is somehow better, or that like Nazis are somehow better. Or that somehow they're on the same plane. Right. Because they're not. Like, they're not.
No, that's right. Like, I admittedly do get a bit defensive when talking to some of my fellow SJWs, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't change the value system that I have.
Of course. Of course.
So it's weird to me that people think that being called a racist makes being a Nazi more reasonable somehow.
Or that somehow, and we saw this with Charlottesville when Trump gave that press conference talking about, how the alt-left were just as bad as the alt-right and this false equivalence shit, which is gross. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, I've been critical of things like the Black Bloc and Antifa and stuff on my show. I've been critical of violence and things like that. But having said that, right, I don't support violence. I don't support people blowing shit up. I don't support, anything like that. But there's a difference between that, which is a very small fraction of what's really actually going on, and huge groups of people with tiki torches yelling, "You will not replace us." There's a huge difference. And to sort of equate the two as being the same, yeah, you can have criticism of both and you can call out the problems with both. But to say that they're kind of the same is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
Yeah, that's right. I find, and I mean, it's kind of a tangent, but I find that the idea, people misunderstand what Antifa is, because without fascists, there would be no anti-fascists.
That's true.
So it's funny because they think of them as like, oh, this other authoritarian group that's going to try and take over society and instigate whatever communist plot they have. And essentially, they'll just go away to their lives if the Nazis stop showing up.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And I know that some who show up, because the whole thing about Charlottesville, because the whole thing was just sad and heartbreaking in terms of the loss of Heather Heyer and the violence that happened. And my sympathies go out to her family. I mean, it's just awful. Because that was, I think, one of the darkest moments in American life that I've experienced. It was one of those days where I was really ashamed of my country. I was really ashamed to be an American. I was really ashamed that I thought my country was better than this, and it kind of wasn't, and that's heartbreaking. But there are some people within Antifa, because I've been critical of Antifa, and I part of that is just somebody who nonviolence is my default position. But I understand that a lot of them do it out of self-defense. That it seems to me like the fascists who showed up in Charlottesville, they were gunning for a fight. Like they were gunning for a fight. They were looking for it, and they got one. And every time they can spin it so that they end up being martyrs, which I think is really fucked up too. And which is sadly kind of what Trump did for them. The president of the United States legitimately stood in front of the American people and tried to underplay the white supremacists. Yeah. Like that was the moment where I was like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. And I hate to fucking beat a dead horse, but boy, it's fun beating it. Did Dave say anything about that? I fucking doubt it. I think it was when he was on one of his fucking breaks where he grew a fucking beard and acted like Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
I doubt he fucking said anything about that. Fucking tool. Anyway, so yeah, that was pretty distressing for me. And I know there are a lot of misconceptions about Antifa, and I fell into some of those misconceptions, I think. I just think the main thing that's important right now in this moment, I've already come up with a title for this podcast. It's called The Implications of Politics. And I'm constantly obsessed with not just what decisions we make, but the implications of the decisions that we make, right. and what the effects of them mean. And I'm just trying to figure out where can we go from here? Where can we improve things? I mean, for me, it's us atheists, we need to be more vocal than ever. I think that atheists and secularists and humanists, we need to be as vocal as possible against Trump and against authoritarianism and against fascism. I think that we should be on the front line saying this is wrong. And if you're a Trump supporter who listens to this show and you're an atheist, I will talk to you. I'm interested in what your viewpoint is on this. I know there's one person on Twitter who I follow who is an atheist, who's a Trump supporter and a libertarian, who I really want to get on the show, but I haven't got him yet, but I really want to get him on here. But it's just about, there are consequences for the actions that people take. Or more importantly, there's also consequences and implications of what people don't do. And in a moment of gross just injustice and corruption and authoritarianism, the hill you're going to die on, the thing that you're obsessed with is how many gender pronouns there are. That's the thing you want to obsess about. That's the thing you want to be mad about. That's the thing you're going to rail against. You know? Go fuck yourself. Like on what level do you think that that's responsible? Like seriously, you think critically about that. You know? And I guess that's my big point is that like we need to be more critical of people, especially people we like. Because we might end up figuring out that they kind of suck. Because that's what I did with Rubin. I mean, I just sort of became a skeptic and I just kind of investigated it. I looked at the evidence and I went, this guy kind of sucks. And that's kind of where I kind of stopped.
I can appreciate that.
But it's about being critical and not just of people you disagree with, but especially with people that you agree with. Like those are often the people you should be harder on, man. For example, I'm a fan of Michael Shermer. I like Michael Shermer's work. I've quoted him before, and I don't think he's a bad guy. But the fact that he fucking tweeted out how awesome Stefan Molyneux is, that's what the fuck. He called him like an articulate voice for reason. My ass. I mean, what the fuck? Like, that's crazy to me. That's insane. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, like, I don't think Shermer looks that deeply into it. Yeah. I just don't think he has any concept of it. I really don't. Because, go ahead.
Yeah. No, he was one of the reasons I went from atheist to skeptic.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Like he wrote books on why we believe things and how we need to examine the way our brains work and how our brains make decisions before we rationally or actually realize it. Mm-hmm. And it was like when I first started skepticism, he was the man, right?
Yeah.
But I think that I noticed some issues with where I disagreed with him when Occupy Wall Street was going on, and I disagreed with him when I decided I wasn't a libertarian anymore. But slowly, and he's always kind of been this guy that I always wanted to like, but I keep going further and further away from, if you know what I mean.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think he's a terrific writer. And I think he makes a lot of really great big picture arguments. I mean, I think his book, The Moral Arc, is excellent. But I think that there are times where, you know, for a guy who talks a lot about skepticism, he's not terribly skeptical of some of the things even he says. And that's everybody, right? Like, But at the same time, like, for me, it seems like the problem I have with a lot of these folks, and you know what? And I'm saying this because this is a criticism of me, because I sort of took a lot of stuff about Rubin on face value. I did. And that's my bad, right? And part of that had to do with the fact, well, he's having all these cool atheists on. And that was how it happened. They get you in with the atheism and they make you leave when it's about the alt-right. But you know, it's I can't. You got me with you know, Cara Santa Maria talking about science, and you had me leave, and Lauren Southern apologized for Richard Spencer. But is this idea that you know, I don't think like somebody like Shermer doesn't always take the time to think out exactly who he's talking to. He's just talking to somebody, right? So like he goes and talks to somebody like Stefan Molyneux, or he goes on Joe Rogan's podcast and talks to fucking crazy ass Graham Hancock, or fucking, or he goes on Rubin's show. I mean, he's willing to like talk to a bunch of different people, which I applaud that. That's cool. But that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't be like, oh, this guy's great. What an articulate voice for skepticism.
Yeah.
Really?
Like, sure, go on Stefan Molyneux's show, but tweeting that he's a great skeptic or the most articulate voice for skepticism doesn't sound like a good thing to tweet.
No. And there wasn't a lot of skepticism that went into it, which is just like, come on. But a part of that shows his bias, right? Like Shermer is a right libertarian. Like he has right libertarian beliefs. Like he is you know, like me, he's a former objectivist. So he has a lot of those same views. The difference is there's so that's always my thing is I think the overriding sort of topic of tonight that I was really interested in getting across is the idea that like, my buddy Trav, Trav, I think, Trav's a great person. Trav tweeted out something the other day about, kill your idols or smash your idols. And I understand that. I get that. But I think the overriding thing I would say is I would modify that a little bit, being the sort of compromiser I am, wishy-washy, I'm waiting for the comments. Anyway, is criticize your idols, and think critically about the people who you're receiving content from, genuinely evaluate things, and read opposing viewpoints and listen to different ideas and legitimately try to absorb different arguments. Don't do what Dave Rubin does, where he talks about how much he loves hearing different viewpoints, but mainly just talks to conservatives. Like genuinely actually seek out different points of view and come to your own conclusion. I think that's my overriding thing about it. It's just be skeptical of your idols, man.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes if it's not more about being like the method of skepticism. Like, and this is something that Steve Novella once said, actually, when he was on my show Brainstorm, that people get hung up on the identity of being a skeptic and they stop applying the method of skepticism.
I love that. He's right. He's totally right. That's it. And that is exactly what happened to me. That's exactly what I did with some of the stuff with Rubin and with some of the stuff on YouTube, where I accepted the labels he was describing himself as on the surface, and didn't think further. But then once I did, that was when I went, oh, this is radically different. I love that. That's a great insight from Dr. Novella. I love him. He's fantastic.
Oh yeah.
I'd love to have him on my show at some point, but
so far he's the one guy that I started listening to early on in my skepticism that hasn't disappointed me in some way.
He's the best. He's really the best. I really, really like him. He's great. Skeptic's Guide is wonderful. Because I'm also a huge fan of Cara Santa Maria, and I just absolutely loved it when she joined the cast. I was just thrilled because I love those guys. I think they do great work. And Novella's fantastic. And so
I love that they don't get into politics. I love that they focus on what they do skepticism against pseudoscience and supernatural claims, and they don't even really touch religion much. They just do skepticism and they keep at it and they don't falter. No,
I love that. I really, really love that. And I think one thing they did a while back, maybe last year. Oh, it was around the time that California was considering the changes to their vaccine legislation, and they even, Dr. Novella led it. Stephen Novella led it with something like, "Guys, we really don't normally talk about politics on the show. It's not really our thing, but we need to talk a little bit about this." And they sort of talked about the pros and cons of the legislation and what it could improve for public health and things like that. Yeah. And I love that. I thought that was a really great way of using skepticism to not be necessarily political, but to evaluate public policy, which I think is really great, because there's a huge difference between using skepticism to talk about politics and using skepticism as a means of trying to understand public policy. I think those really are two different things, because one's about theory and one is about practice. And I thought that what they did was really, really excellent. I mean, trust me. I mean, it's very interesting to me because, like, I don't really know any of their political beliefs. The only two I know are Cara, who is very liberal, and Evan Bernstein, who's a libertarian. Other than that, I have no idea, which I'm okay with. That's fine with me. You know, I'm already too political as it is. So, it's fine. We can keep some of it apolitical. But anyway, so I guess we'll start finishing up. I have taken so much of your time. Thank you so much.
It's been a great chat. For
an excellent conversation. I thoroughly appreciate it. Thank you for letting me get my bitch session out. I really appreciate it a lot. Where can people find your stuff?
The best place is thebrainstormpodcast.com or thehardcoreskeptic.com. That's where you can find just about anything that I produce.
Awesome. And they're producing really great shows over there, guys. Please go over there and give them a subscribe on YouTube. I listen as regularly as I can, especially when I'm working on things at work when it gets kind of boring. I work with newspaper microfilm a lot, and sometimes it's very tedious, so podcast helps.
For sure.
As for me, folks, you can always reach me at the Daily Clark. That's on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. It's also my YouTube username. Please check out our website, reasonrevolution.org. There's a new blog post up there. I just wrote an essay about Sam Harris and the parallels between his concept of the moral landscape and the philosophy of utilitarianism. So please give that a read. Give me some feedback on that. You can always follow our new podcast Twitter, Reason Revolution Pod, at Reason Revolution Pod. So we've got a separate Twitter now. You can also subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. And now we're on Google Play. I had a friend of mine who let me know we're not on Google Play, but we're on Google Play now. So you can find us there as well. And see what else. Facebook.com/Reason Revolution, all lowercase. We've gotten nearly to 500 likes. I'm pretty excited. We're getting close where the numbers are growing, and it's fantastic. So yeah, that's where you folks can reach me. Cory, thanks again for coming on the show. It's been a super, super great time talking to you.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a great night. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.